Hello, listeners, and welcome to our podcast. My name is Lynn Radford. Today, I'm joined by Dan Gavrilliu, cybersecurity expert from fintech pioneer Maxcode. For the next half hour, we will be discussing the challenges and best practices associated with building not only secure, but also scalable solutions in the financial sector to support future growth. So hello, Dan, and thanks for joining us.
Hello, Lynn. It's really nice to be here.
So listen, before we dive into the topic of cybersecurity and fintech, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get started in cybersecurity?
It initially started with my own personal concern for my mother, actually, in the sense that for a lot of people, security is fairly difficult to digest. And as an end user, it's really difficult to actually figure out what you need to do or things like that. In the more recent years, that actually providing value to end users was the main focus for what I was trying to get at with security. Usually for a developer, it is common sense to have some concepts of security and cybersecurity and how to ensure that the applications that you develop are done properly and secure. And basically, my take on this is that it should also be user focused, and sometimes it can get quite complex. And somebody does need to know, to some extent at least, those complexities and to figure out when it's something that you should handle or when it's something that somebody else should handle. What matters a lot to me is actually understanding what cybersecurity is, what are threats to applications and to end users. And basically, in that regard, I've tried to help other colleagues in Maxcode. I've made some workshops and some presentations regarding cybersecurity to help our colleagues have a better understanding of how they should tackle such matters in their projects.
Okay. And you mentioned threats. What are the biggest threats when it comes to cybersecurity nowadays, really?
Unfortunately, there are quite a few of them.
I thought so.
So the first threat that comes to mind is the actual developer, in the sense that with a lack of knowledge, developers would tend to not take into account specific security practices or to not consider them as important as they are for their project. So by understanding, for instance, what sort of threats and what their impact is, they can decide what's best for their project. And obviously, sometimes this actually means that, okay, you need to admit you don't know this, and maybe you need some guidance, or maybe you need to discuss with somebody that knows more than you about cybersecurity. In Maxcode, I'm that person, so to
That's
speak.
you, exactly. So they come to
Um,
you, right? Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
and I myself go to others when it's needed. So at Maxcode, we build the project, we do our own assessment and review and make sure that we are following best practices and guidelines and using our previous experiences. But where it is needed, where the project itself is more sensitive or has a high risk adversity, we discuss with the client and we recommend having third-party pen testing or other types of evaluations that we can properly test the extent to which what we delivered is or isn't affected by the latest, most urgent matters. The main reason for this is that it's physically impossible for any one entity to have a clear understanding of the latest security threats, the latest 0 days on every and each platform, on any and every programming language or framework that is being used. Basically, it's like every speck of sand on the beach. That's how many
It's
types
so
of threats there
complex.
can be.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And it's completely unscalable to also develop software and have extensive knowledge about all of the types of cybersecurity threats that are present in the ecosystem, especially since those can pop up each and every day.
So, in terms of the threats that companies are facing, you mentioned developers is a big threat in the context of cybersecurity, and there are lots of other threats. Can you maybe give a couple of examples of other kinds of threats that are out
Yeah,
there that are facing companies?
actually, thank you. I don't want to leave the impression that developers are
Or
the
the only
pain
threat?
point or something like that. Developers are humans, and human beings are susceptible to all kinds of issues, which is why other types of people that are part of the development process are just as easily likely to be indirectly or even directly targeted by cybersecurity attacks, which can actually lead to exploits being done on the applications themselves. So for instance, hypothetically speaking, somebody could target my local setup, my professional working station that I usually use from home. And by doing that, they could actually gain access to web applications that I'm helping develop or to actual production environments. And by doing that, they could basically escalate to even end users and infect them as well. The exact same approach could be applied to any person in the entire life cycle of an application, whether it's a business analyst, whether it's a product owner, whether it's just a customer that's somewhat more involved in the development of the application or the support or maintenance of it. All of these types of people, for instance, could be targeted to some extent, which is actually important to ensure that companies that do develop applications have strict internal policies as well for the way of work that they do. So that's why I'm referring again to the first step in everything related to cybersecurity, which is knowledge.
Mhm.
Understanding the types of threats that can happen, and most of the times, if you don't really understand the impact some issue might have, some vulnerability might have, you might end up considering it doesn't matter. I'll do that later. Unfortunately, when later comes, it might be too late, and you might already have some serious issues in your application, or worse, actually have data leaks or actually even worse.
Exactly. No.
And
Okay, so
yeah,
the stakes are pretty high, right? So all companies, whether in the financial sector or any other sector, have a responsibility and also
yes.
an intention, and it's in their own interest to protect
Um,
the data and the safety and security of the data.
yeah,
Are there any kind of fundamental best practices that companies can or should implement to kind of prevent this from happening from a cybersecurity point of view?
first one would be knowledge.
Right.
In the sense that, let's say I'm not software development company, I'm business related company to some extent.
Mhm.
Um, I should at least be able to understand the impact of cybersecurity threats to my business. And based on that, then I can decide what sort of additional actions I can take. Request official evaluation from third parties that are certified in cybersecurity.
Mhm.
But the idea is that in order to take action, you need to understand how urgent it is.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Maxcode as a company, I heard that Maxcode has been doing fintech pretty much before it was even called fintech, right? So you've been around as a company for quite a long time.
Yes, yes.
How have you been? What do you do? What does the company do exactly, and how does that fit in terms of helping your customers from a cybersecurity perspective?
We try to understand the business as much as possible. We can't give our opinions or professional advice or recommendations unless we understand your way of working. And the more open the communication is between us and you, the easier is for us to advise you. So in that sense, I'm more than happy to say that when you don't need any cybersecurity advice and when you don't need to apply some additional protocols or processes or even features or something like that, then that's the best option. So the best option with cybersecurity is if it is possible and secure, you shouldn't do anything, but you need to evaluate that and you need to understand what it is involved. Our focus is on delivering business value
Mhm.
and applications that help that business value. So because with our goals, it is extremely important to take into consideration security at all steps of the development process and to apply them according to the legal requirements and capabilities of the project itself. That's why we also need to have an understanding about security. And um, that's why it's actually really, really important to have an open communication with customers as well.
Mhm.
So the first recommendation in that regard would be open communication, and we'll try as much as possible to nag you if it's possible, especially for security related aspects, because they are really important to us as a company. And we're really open about what we are competent in doing and what is out of our expertise. And that's, from my perspective, that level of transparency is something that you should ask for in any business partner of any sort.
And in terms of scalability, because at Maxcode you're very focused on supporting companies all the way through their growth cycle, right? From the start
Yeah.
right up to enabling them to be scalable. So how does cybersecurity fit into that, the considerations at the start? I guess you're laying the foundation for the future, right?
If we do provide good foundation, it does make it easier to start. The thing is that cybersecurity as a concept, let's say, is as a response to cyber threats. That's basically what we're doing as developers or as the good people, so to speak. And because of that, we always need to improve to ensure that we're one step ahead of the bad actors, so to speak. And that's why, even though you do lay out good foundations, you need to have recurring activities in place to ensure that things are up to date. So I mentioned about third-party libraries being exposed and vulnerable and then being exploited. You don't know when that is going to happen. If you don't check constantly and you don't get feedback from those checks and you don't take actions from that feedback, at some point it's going to happen. And there are many different types of tools that you can use. We use a lot of different strategies and tools to help in the development process. We also actually use processes as well. We define custom processes depending on the project by understanding the business requirements and the capabilities that are applicable. Because on the one hand, there might be projects where they're internally completely shut down from public internet or completely isolated, or where the level of security requirements that is warranted is not very strict. And that comes either from the type of data that the application handles, the regulations of the industry it operates in. So that's another reason why our communication with the customer is really important, because it depends a lot on individual projects and their needs.
Right. Most of the projects you work on are in the financial sector, though, right? The companies you work
Yes,
together with are in
yes,
the
yes.
financial sector. Can you give maybe some examples of, without naming the companies necessarily, but of how you've helped specific companies to mitigate cybersecurity threats or advise them or
Yes, so some of the more recent examples are with various types of analyses we've done. For instance, some customers don't know exactly where their current security posture, so to speak, and they actually need to understand how big is their problem and how much they should work on it. And quite recently, we've done some security analysis for some APIs. The security part was actually part of a a much bigger analysis for their entire project. For other customers, we can work with them to understand if they have changed regulations. The purpose of those regulations is to ensure that there is at least a common level of quality or standardization in the security that you provide or in some other areas that are relevant.
Right, it's to protect companies and also end users, right? So that's at
Yeah,
the end of the day, the whole reason behind things. Okay, so it's for the common good at the end of the day. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay. Have you got any other examples you could give us?
I would say we do internal reviews of the security posture of the projects we work on, and things do change over time. We quite recently found out some older projects where the way third-party libraries were being handled was not ideal. I'm specifically talking about Angular, which is a very well-known front-end development framework. And the way we were using it is based on default documented approaches. However, the common way of doing things is actually vulnerable to some types of exploits. In this particular case, it was also for just an internal project, so the scope of any potential vulnerability was very, very limited. It wasn't a realistic vulnerability, but that particular scenario also helped developers involved in understanding this and addressing it. It helped them better understand the sort of issue that can happen.
What kind of trends do you see in the future in terms of cybersecurity, and how are technologies like AI and maybe blockchain and things like that likely to impact cybersecurity in fintech?
So security vulnerabilities can exist in anything created by human beings.
Or
Um,
machines, maybe even nowadays, right? So,
yeah. So AIs basically are created by humans. Some large language models are so complex that it's very difficult to address them from all perspectives. I would say that depending on the way you use AI in your software project, it can lead to um, basically a complete new set of types of vulnerabilities. When, as a developer, you, let's say, install a new tool, you should be aware of what you're installing. You should validate what you're installing and make sure that it is the right thing. You should be sure that it's not easily exploitable. So maybe don't install in a company context something that is sustained by a single developer, and he does it as a, how should I put it, as a hobby every once in a while, because it might end up to being exploited much more easily than something that is more sustained by a larger group of people or something along those lines. With the rise of with the rise of AI, a lot of developers are using AI to write code. What ends up happening is that some developers could potentially end up being too confident in the code that the large language model, ChatGPT or Copilot, or there are quite a few of them, that the AI basically gives them. And sure, okay, that code looks good. Okay, then I'll just deliver it to production. Let's say maybe we test it first, and that's pretty much it. And without policies in place to ensure security as well, that code might lead to a zero-day vulnerability.
yeah.
And the thing is that basically with AI, developers deliver code faster. Delivering code faster implies that the number of zero-day vulnerabilities increases.
What do you mean by 0 day?
Zero-day refers to a type of vulnerability that has somehow just been discovered. So depending on how a vulnerability is, software company learns about a vulnerability they have, it could be considered 0-day if, let's say, they just publicly speaking, they just found out about it. And they don't yet have a fix for it or a way of circumventing that vulnerability or of reducing the impact the vulnerability has to their customers. And why those types of vulnerabilities are very interesting is that there's no way of fixing them, and that's why they're very valuable to attackers. So attackers, that's their, let's say, somehow bread and butter or something like that. The more new vulnerabilities they can find out, the better it is for them, which is the worse for us. Good to be aware of that, and something to take into account. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use AI. That means that you should use AI responsibly. Do your job right, evaluate all of the things that you should evaluate for that piece of code, and make sure that it adheres to the practices that you should follow.
Okay, so I was going to say it's important for companies that are working with companies like Maxcode, for example, to kind of maybe check and ask whether the developers within those companies are using AI and to what extent. And if they are, like you say, it's not a problem to use AI, but to make sure that they've got the checks and the protocols in place to make sure that they're using AI responsibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to be clear about the use of AI, I'm strictly speaking from security standpoint and generally speaking about possibility that AI can increase productivity.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to say about the technologies and how that's kind of changing, or your predictions for the future?
I've seen a lot of traction recently for passwordless technologies, or if not for passwordless, at least for passkey technologies. Basically, passwordless is, simplest way to put it is no need to use a password at all. You're automatically authenticated based on communication between, let's say, the browser that you're using and your operating system and some additional biometry authentication or something like that, depending on the use case. That means that no more passwords. I would love a future where passwords no longer exist. We're human beings. We shouldn't have to remember those types of things. That those types of things don't bring us value and don't enable us to bring value to others. Those are just steps in the way that we need to do to ensure attackers have smaller chances of winning, basically.
Right, but so companies in the financial sector are kind of caught between, as we say, like a rock and a hard place, right? Because
Yeah,
on the one hand, you want to make the customer experience as convenient and easy as possible, so no passwords and everything. But on the other hand, you're responsible and you want to make sure you protect their data and protect, eliminate as many vulnerabilities as possible. So it's
yeah.
really tricky for them to be kind of to strike the right balance, I guess.
The nice thing is that with somewhat newer technologies, I would say it's becoming a little easier to do that, in the sense that the passwordless protocols I mentioned can usually be applied rather safely with even today's laptops. And because of the protocols in place to communicate between the browser and the operating system to ensure proper authentication via passwordless flow, there is a relevant level of security involved in the process. This actually is quite relevant for some of the compliance requirements for regulation procedures. And there's also different options of doing this with mobile phones. So from that regard, with mobile phones, there's a very big potential with biometry related authentication, which links very well with passwordless browser-based authentication. And yeah, I understand that there's some discussions for some types of users because some types of people tend to avoid those types of authentication methods. I don't want any personal details being stored, any personally identifiable information for biometry authentication in most scenarios is stored on the device. So it's not being sent out to the system that you want to authenticate against. It's completely isolated, and that's actually the intent of protocols such as WebAuthn, I believe, if I remember correctly, or other passwordless technologies. And yeah.
Yeah, so the mobile first trend is actually working in favor of cybersecurity protection in a way then.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
As long as the device and the vendor of the device accept it, it should most of the times be stored, that biometry data is stored on the device and not transmitted. And as from the development side, I tend to encourage clients and projects to use these types of authentication mechanisms.
Yeah. Okay, Dan, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners about cybersecurity and fintech in the financial sector in general?
I would say that for me personally, security at first really seems like something really big, really scary, really complex. And I think it's the best example possible of how you should climb a mountain, in the sense of doing it one step at a time. Depending on your use case, it's perfectly fine to just stop over the first hill. It's fine to stop over the second hill. It's important to actually do something in that regard and not expect things to work out if you don't do anything about it, because the security landscape is changing a lot.
Okay, if I were to ask you to sum up the key takeaways from the discussion we've just had over the past half an hour or so, what would be the main thing that you would like listeners to take away with them from listening to us today?
Always try to learn.
Okay.
And see cybersecurity as something interesting to learn about, to understand how it applies to you. Basically, try to do some sort of a threat analysis. And it's perfectly fine if you can't handle something, if you can't or won't do something, but it should be a informed, responsible decision. Ideally, if it's something important that is way outside of your league or something like that, there are other people that can help. At Maxcode, we also provide some assistance in this area, but the overall idea is that you're definitely not alone, to understand your limitations and, if possible, try to improve them.
Sounds good to me. Okay, and I think one way that that listeners can stay informed about the latest trends and developments is by signing up for your newsletter. Is that right? At maxcode.net?
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's a link at the bottom of the homepage where people can sign up for the newsletter. And okay, then I'd say thanks again for joining us, Dan. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and hear all about it.
Thank you for
Welcome.
your time. It
You
was lovely
too.
to have this discussion.
It's very nice to talk to you. Besides signing up for the newsletter, you can find lots more information on the Maxcode website, including more case studies and examples of how the next level tech is helping companies to provide high performance solutions. And of course, that's a great way to contact Maxcode if you have any questions about anything we've discussed today. So once again, Dan, thanks for joining us, and I'll say bye for now.
Bye-bye.